Maid tried to kill CEO on day one but ended up as his beloved wife. The question that wouldn't let go. Can a heart that no longer believes in love learn how to love again? That question lingered like an echo in a dark corridor when you couldn't silence no matter how many doors you shut. He had everything a man could want. At least, that was the story everyone else believed. A penthouse with glass walls that caught the first morning light of Manhattan. A garage lined with cars whose price tags could fund entire scholarships. His name printed in bold on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, the Wall Street Journal. 1,000 employees waiting for his signature before they moved an inch. To the world, he was proof that ambition could build an empire. But alone, at 2 in the morning, he walked barefoot across hardwood floors, listening to the silence pressing against him. The city's hum outside was faint, like a lullaby that refused to soothe. He could buy every distraction, wine that cost more than rent in the Bronx, art flown in from Paris, silk sheets woven in Italy. He could buy everything except a single night of peace. And somewhere else, miles from the high-rises and the luxury addresses, she was living a life most people never paused to look at. Her shoes were scuffed from years of walking, her bag second-hand but sturdy, her hands marked by work that left tiny scars no lotion could erase. She lived in a small apartment where the kitchen tiles didn't match, where the heater clicked like an old clock in winter, and where a single fern sat by the window because it was the only thing she'd managed to keep alive through all seasons. To him, life was a performance. Cameras, investors, boardrooms, flight itineraries. To her, life was a quiet test of endurance. Bills stacked on the counter, a job that paid just enough to survive, neighbors who didn't know her name. He drowned in excess. She lived in restraint. They were parallel lines, close enough to exist in the same city but destined never to touch. And yet one night the universe bent those lines just slightly. The man who was used to owning boardrooms stepped into a moment that felt like losing control. It wasn't in a gala hall or an industry conference where fate decided to amuse itself. It happened in the raw, ordinary chaos of real life, where no one wears masks polished enough for glossy magazines. She was there, too, standing in the middle of her own storm. Not polished, not glowing with the kind of beauty the wealthy collect like trophies. Just present, with eyes that didn't waver when they met his. Eyes that didn't ask for anything, didn't worship, didn't fear. It was a look that unsettled him more than the fiercest competitor he had ever faced. Because everyone wanted something from him, access, protection, money, a shortcut to power. Everyone bent their words, sweetened their tones, careful not to disturb the gravity he carried in every room. But she didn't. She looked at him as if he were simply a man standing too close, as if all his achievements meant nothing beyond that. And in that instant, a shift happened. He should have dismissed it, walked away, forgotten her face the moment he turned the corner. But the look stayed, sharp as a splinter. Who is she to stand there like that, he thought. And why do I feel like I've been seen for the first time in years? The truth was, she hadn't even tried. She wasn't searching for him, wasn't dreaming of men like him. She didn't want to be saved because she had already learned how to survive. What she wanted was something rare, something he couldn't buy at any price, to be understood. If someone had told him earlier that his world would soon collide with a woman like that, he would have laughed, waved them off, and moved on to his next meeting. He didn't believe in collisions. He believed in strategies, in forecasts, in plans written down in binders. Collisions were for people who didn't control their lives. But then again, control was an illusion. He had built an empire on it, but he could feel it crumbling in the late hours when his chest tightened and sleep refused to come. And she wasn't looking for answers. She wasn't haunted by questions the way he was. But she carried her own wounds, tucked away beneath quiet routines, hidden in the way she smiled without letting it reach her eyes. She knew what it meant to lose, to rebuild, to wake up with nothing and still keep walking. 2 worlds, 2 silences, when they finally stood in the same space. He in his tailored suit, she in her simple clothes. It wasn't attraction that struck first. It was friction, like 2 storms colliding, each refusing to surrender ground. Their first words weren't soft. Their first glances weren't warm. But sometimes the most powerful beginnings don't come dressed as beginnings at all. They arrive disguised as resistance. He looked at her as if asking silently, "Who are you and why do you think you can look at me like that?" She met his gaze and didn't flinch. "Your world doesn't scare me." And just like that, the question that had haunted him, the one about whether a broken heart could learn to love again, suddenly found a new shape. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't the one with all the answers. And she, without even meaning to, became the question he couldn't stop asking. Power looks glamorous from the outside. But when you are the one holding it, it feels less like a crown and more like a chain. He was 38 years old and already the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. His name, Daniel Whitmore, was printed in gold letters on the glass walls of Whitmore Global Holdings, a company that stretched its influence from real estate to technology to media. His net worth had crossed the billion-dollar mark 3 years earlier, but numbers no longer meant anything to him. They rose, they fell like tides he had long stopped celebrating. People said he was blessed with everything, a face sharp enough to command attention, an intellect that could cut through the toughest negotiations, and a relentless drive that terrified his competitors. To the public, Daniel was the kind of man people either envied or worshipped. When he entered a room, silence followed. When he spoke, deals were sealed. And yet, he hadn't felt whole in years. The truth was buried under layers of perfectly tailored suits, staged interviews, and headlines that praised him as the visionary of Wall Street. Behind closed doors, Daniel lived in fragments. His office, on the 78th floor of a skyscraper, was designed to impress. Mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, a hidden bar stocked with rare whiskeys. But the man sitting behind that desk often stared at the skyline without really seeing it. The city looked alive from up there, millions of lights twinkling across Manhattan. But to him it all felt like a photograph, beautiful, untouchable, and utterly fake. His days were scheduled down to the minute. 6 a.m. workouts with his trainer, 7:30 breakfast meetings, flights to Los Angeles, London, or Singapore depending on which subsidiary needed him. He slept 4 hours on average, powered by caffeine and sheer will. To his board of directors, this made him unstoppable. To Daniel, it made him numb. But the numbness was better than what came before it, because if Daniel's empire had a foundation, it was built not only on ambition but also on the ashes of betrayal. Years ago, when he was still climbing, he had loved once, recklessly, fully, with the belief that money and love could coexist. Her name was Elise. She had walked into his life when he was nothing more than a hungry entrepreneur with a half-furnished apartment. She laughed at his terrible cooking, believed in his impossible ideas, and stood beside him through the sleepless nights. Until she didn't. When the first million came in, Elise was gone. Not quietly, no, she left with a storm. Lawsuits, leaked files, whispers of infidelity. She had known where to strike, and she did. By the time the smoke cleared, Daniel had won the legal battles but lost the only person who had ever seen him before the world turned him into a headline. He never spoke her name again. But the wound stayed. It bled into his habits, into the way he kept people at arm's length, into the way he trusted contracts more than promises, into the way he locked his emotions in a vault no one could reach. So now, when people looked at Daniel Whitmore and saw strength, they were only seeing the armor. Inside, he was a man haunted by the echo of a single truth. The higher you climbed, the lonelier it became. Even his victories felt hollow. The night he signed a deal worth $7 billion, his board toasted with champagne, laughing, congratulating him. Daniel smiled for the cameras, shook hands, and delivered a speech polished to perfection. Then, when the lights dimmed, he went home to his penthouse and stood by the glass wall, watching snow fall silently over Central Park. He had a bottle of Glenfiddich 40-year-old whiskey in his hand, but he never opened it. What was the point of celebrating when there was no one to clink glasses with? Sleep was his cruelest enemy. He could silence the board, silence the press, silence his competitors. But at night, silence turned on him. Memories flooded in, and the questions he buried during the day clawed their way back. What was it all for? Why did every victory taste like ash? Could he keep building an empire if he had no one to share it with? Daniel had mastered the art of pretending that he didn't care about love, pretending that solitude was a choice, not a sentence, pretending that his past no longer had power over him, but the body never lies. His doctor warned him that stress had eroded his health. His trainer noticed when his punches slowed during sparring. Even his assistant, the one person who saw him at his worst, sometimes caught the shadow in his expression when he thought no one was looking. Still, Daniel refused to admit weakness. Weakness was a language he had unlearned. He told himself he didn't need sleep, didn't need warmth, didn't need anything beyond the numbers on his spreadsheets. And then she appeared. Not a Lise, not a ghost of the past, but someone entirely different. A woman without polish, without pretense, without the desperation he was so accustomed to seeing in others. She entered his world not with flattery or fear, but with a quiet defiance that pierced through his carefully built walls. Daniel didn't know it yet, but her presence would become the one variable he couldn't calculate, the one truth he couldn't bend into profit. For now, all he knew was this. For the first time in years, he had looked at someone and felt something stir, something that wasn't ambition, wasn't control, wasn't the endless hunger for more. It was something softer, more dangerous, something that reminded him of the man he used to be before the world taught him that power was safer than love. If Daniel Whitmore was the kind of man the world recognized from magazine covers, she was the kind of woman the world rarely noticed at all. Her name was Anna Morales. She was 34, and her life had been anything but easy. She wasn't a socialite, a model, or a polished professional stepping out of glass towers. She was a woman who had walked through storms and somehow found the strength to keep moving forward. Anna grew up in Queens in a modest two-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. Her father worked construction, her mother stitched clothes at a factory. Money was always tight, and dinner often meant stretching one chicken to feed 5 mouths. By 16, Anna was already helping pay the bills, waitressing after school, tutoring kids in the neighborhood, saving every dollar she could. She never expected a fairy tale. Life had taught her too early that stability was fragile. At 25, she married a man who promised her safety. For a while, she believed him, but dreams cracked under the weight of unpaid debts and his spiraling temper. The divorce left her with nothing but her last name and a stack of credit card statements. She paid them off slowly, month after month, working extra shifts, refusing to let ruin define her. That was the thing about Anna. She broke, but she rebuilt. By her early 30s, she had steadied her life. She worked as a paralegal at a small firm in Midtown, nothing glamorous, nothing that screamed success. But she was good at it. She was thorough, sharp, and unflinching in the face of difficult clients. Her colleagues respected her, even if they didn't always understand her guardedness. Outside of work, Anna lived quietly. She rented a one-bedroom apartment in Astoria. The heating rattled in the winter, and the pipes moaned when the neighbors ran their showers, but it was hers. On Sundays, she cooked for herself, simple meals, arroz con pollo the way her mother used to make it, or pasta with garlic and olive oil. She had a fern by the window that she watered religiously because it reminded her that life needed small, consistent acts to survive. Most nights, Anna read before bed. Not romances, never romances. They felt like lies. She preferred biographies, stories of people who had endured, who had failed and risen again. She underlined passages that spoke to her, tucking them into her memory like prayers. But beneath her resilience, there was a silence no one saw. Anna had been disappointed enough to learn that expectations were dangerous. She didn't want grand gestures, didn't crave someone to sweep her away. What she wanted was simple, someone to understand her without trying to fix her, someone to stand beside her, not in front of her or behind her. And that, ironically, was what made her dangerous to a man like Daniel Whitmore. Because unlike everyone else orbiting his empire, Anna wasn't impressed by power. She had lived through enough to know money couldn't buy peace of mind. She had sat in lawyers' offices with bills she couldn't pay, watched her marriage crumble despite promises written in rings, and faced mornings where she didn't know how to keep going but did anyway. Power meant nothing to her unless it came with honesty. She carried herself with quiet strength. She wasn't loud, wasn't flashy. But when she walked into a room, people noticed, not because of beauty polished for display, but because of presence. Her eyes were steady, her back straight, her tone calm even in conflict. Anna wasn't the kind of woman you could intimidate, and that unsettled men who tried. At work, she handled arrogant clients with the patience of a seasoned negotiator. She didn't flinch when voices rose. She didn't shrink when someone tried to pull rank. Instead, she listened, waited, and cut through the noise with questions that went straight to the heart. She wasn't there to please, she was there to understand. And though she didn't realize it yet, this quiet defiance, the refusal to bend, the insistence on standing in her own space, was exactly what would put her in Daniel Whitmore's path. Because Daniel was a man used to control, to deference, to admiration. But Anna didn't need him. She didn't even want him, and nothing stung a man like Daniel more than irrelevance. Still, she wasn't unkind. Anna's strength wasn't rooted in bitterness. She could laugh, soft and genuine, when a stranger's dog tugged at her shoelaces on the subway. She could pause in the middle of a hectic day to buy coffee for the paralegal interns who couldn't afford the overpriced lattes in Midtown. She could forgive, though not easily, and when she did, it was because she had chosen to, not because she was too weak to resist. That was the essence of her choice. Anna Morales lived deliberately. Every decision, what to spend, who to trust, when to walk away, was made with the awareness of someone who had lost too much to gamble recklessly again. And that deliberate way of living was about to collide with Daniel's world of excess, speed, and power. The irony was that neither of them wanted it. Daniel wasn't looking for someone like her. Anna certainly wasn't looking for someone like him. But life, in its strange, cruel, and sometimes beautiful way, doesn't ask permission before crossing paths. On an ordinary Tuesday, their lives would intersect. Not with fireworks, not with destiny's glow, but with friction raw, sharp, and unforgettable. Anna would look at him, and for the first time in years, someone would see through Daniel's armor. And Daniel would look at her, and for the first time in years, he would meet someone he couldn't control. Life doesn't announce its turning points. Sometimes it hides them inside ordinary Tuesdays. For Daniel Whitmore, that Tuesday began like any other. A breakfast meeting with venture capitalists uptown, 3 phone calls with international partners, a press release to approve before noon. His schedule ticked forward like clockwork, every minute accounted for. Control, he thrived on it. But control wasn't waiting for him in the lobby of Whitmore Global Holdings. Anna Morales hadn't planned on being there either. Her firm had been hired to review a dispute involving one of Daniel's subsidiaries. Normally, a senior partner would have handled it. But the partner had fallen ill that morning, and Anna was dispatched in his place. "It's just a document drop-off," her boss had said. "In and out, don't waste time." She didn't waste time, she never did, but fate did. The lobby was glass and marble, all sharp lines and intimidating quiet. Men and women in suits flowed past security like parts of a machine. Anna felt the difference instantly. This was a world built for power, and she was just passing through. She straightened her shoulders, walked to the desk, and gave her name. "Please wait," the receptionist said, gesturing toward a cluster of leather chairs. She sat, folder in hand, ignoring the way her reflection looked out of place in the gleaming surfaces. That was when Daniel arrived. Flanked by 2 assistants, phone pressed to his ear, he strode across the lobby like a storm contained inside a suit. His presence bent the air around him. People turned their heads, security guards straightened. The receptionist smiled wider. Anna didn't. She barely looked up. She had seen storms before, but Daniel noticed her anyway. It wasn't attraction, at least not at first. It was irritation. She was sitting too casually, folder balanced on her knee, not scrambling to stand like everyone else. When his shadow fell across her chair, she looked up at him with calm, steady eyes, as if she were looking at any other man walking past. It stopped him mid-stride. "Who are you waiting for?" he asked, voice clipped, authority laced into every syllable. Anna blinked once. "No one in particular. I'm here to drop documents for your legal department." "You don't look like legal." His gaze dropped briefly to her plain navy blazer, her scuffed shoes. She wasn't polished like the corporate lawyers he was used to. "And you don't look like security," she replied evenly, "but here you are questioning me." For a beat, silence. His assistants shifted uncomfortably. The receptionist's smile faltered. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes," Anna said, standing now. She wasn't tall, but her presence didn't shrink against his. "You're the man who's keeping me from finishing my errand." The audacity stung him. No one spoke to him like that. Not investors, not competitors, not even board members who secretly despised him. He should have walked away. He had calls to take, contracts to sign, 1,000 more important things than a woman with a manila folder and an attitude. But something about her refusal to bow down hooked into him. "What's your name?" he asked. "Anna Morales." He repeated it under his breath as if testing the weight. "Well, Ms. Morales," he said finally, "next time you walk into my building, try to remember respect is not optional." Her lips curved, not a smile, more a warning. "Respect is earned, Mr. Whitmore, not demanded." The words sliced between them, sharper than glass. Daniel felt the shift. A line had been drawn in the air, one neither of them would erase. He turned abruptly, signaling his assistants to follow. As he disappeared into the elevator, he told himself she was irrelevant. Just another face, another inconvenience in a day filled with them. But in the mirrored walls of that elevator, he caught his own reflection and saw something unusual. He was still thinking about her. Anna, meanwhile, exhaled slowly once the lobby cleared. She hadn't planned on sparring with a billionaire before lunch, but she wasn't sorry either. Men like him were used to power folding the world in front of them. Someone had to remind him that not everyone was for sale. She dropped the folder at legal, signed the log, and left without looking back. But on the subway ride home, when the train lurched and swayed, she found her thoughts circling. Not about his wealth or his reputation or the sharp cut of his suit, but about his eyes in that brief silence after she had spoken, eyes that looked less like a tyrant's and more like a man who hadn't expected resistance in years. It unsettled her, that thought, so she pushed it away, burying herself in the book she carried in her bag. Still, both of them carried that moment. For Daniel, it was a splinter under the skin, this woman who had neither bowed nor begged, who had met his authority with something stronger than arrogance, indifference. For Anna, it was a flicker she tried to dismiss, a reminder that even the most powerful men were still just men, and that sometimes the walls they built were thinner than they appeared. Neither of them knew it yet, but their collision had already set the course for something neither could control. For a man like Daniel Whitmore, people were predictable. They wanted something, always. Investors wanted returns, politicians wanted donations, employees wanted promotions, women wanted his name attached to theirs. He had long ago learned to read desire like a second language. A glance, a gesture, a smile, everything was transactional, which was why Anna Morales was so disruptive. Days had passed since their sharp exchange in the lobby, and still she lingered in his thoughts. Not her clothes, not her voice, not even the exact words she'd thrown at him. What haunted him was her refusal to bend. Respect is earned, not demanded. It echoed like a refrain in the back of his mind. Daniel had replayed the scene more than once, though he would never admit it aloud. He had walked away expecting her defiance to dissolve into irrelevance, like every other annoyance that crossed his path. Yet instead of fading, the memory sharpened. He found himself recalling the steadiness of her gaze, the unshaken calm in her tone. It wasn't hostility, it was worse. It was indifference. Indifference to a man who commanded rooms was the most dangerous kind of insult. His assistants noticed the way his attention drifted during meetings. His trainer noticed the half-second hesitation in his punches during sparring. Even his doctor, during a routine check, asked if something was distracting him. Daniel brushed them all off. But the truth was, Anna Morales had unsettled him. One night, unable to sleep, he searched her name. It was a habit he denied having, curiosity dressed as due diligence. A few keystrokes, and her life unfolded on the screen in front of him. Not the way lives like his were chronicled. No glossy profiles, no magazine features. Just fragments, a law firm directory, a few court filings she had worked on, a local charity newsletter mentioning her as a volunteer tutor, ordinary, forgettable. And yet Daniel read every line as though decoding a puzzle. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the city skyline outside his penthouse window. "Who are you really?" he muttered under his breath. The question gnawed at him. He had built an empire on controlling outcomes, on anticipating threats and opportunities before they appeared. But Anna was neither threat nor opportunity. She was an anomaly, a variable he hadn't accounted for, and Daniel hated variables. Still, he found himself drawn toward them. The following week, their paths crossed again, this time in a conference room, when Anna's firm attended a preliminary meeting with Whitmore Global's legal team. She entered quietly, not seeking attention, taking her seat at the far end of the table. But Daniel noticed instantly. His eyes tracked her like magnets, unwilling, almost irritated by their own insistence. She didn't look at him, not once. While others deferred to him, glancing for his approval, Anna focused on the documents in front of her. She asked questions, not to impress, but to clarify. She disagreed politely with one of his attorneys, presenting her reasoning with calm precision. And for the first time in years, Daniel listened, not as a CEO evaluating an argument, but as a man struck by the sound of someone speaking without fear of him. "She doesn't see me," he thought, a strange mixture of frustration and fascination tightening his chest. "Not the way everyone else does." After the meeting, his team buzzed around him waiting for direction, contracts, deadlines, strategies. But Daniel's attention remained fixed on the image of Anna gathering her papers, slipping them into her worn leather bag, and walking out without a backward glance. The indifference cut deeper than hatred ever could. That night, Daniel skipped dinner with a senator's campaign committee. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in silence, replaying the way her voice had sounded, firm but steady, like someone who had weathered storms and didn't expect shelter from anyone. Why did it matter? Why her when there were thousands like her in the city? He could have called any woman, filled the silence with laughter, perfume, the easy distraction of bodies and words. But distraction no longer satisfied. Anna wasn't distraction, she was disruption, and disruption was addictive. By the third encounter, he knew it wasn't coincidence. She was tied to the case. She would be around for weeks. The thought both unnerved and intrigued him. He told himself he needed to observe, to understand, to classify her. That was how he approached everything: analysis, categorization, control. But when he saw her again, this time in the cafeteria of his building, waiting patiently in line with an unassuming tray, analysis failed him. She didn't try to cut the line, didn't flash a badge, didn't even glance at the men who stared at her. She stood quietly, like someone used to waiting, like someone who didn't believe her time was more valuable than anyone else's. Daniel, who had not stood in a line for years, found himself pausing at the doorway, unsettled again. He approached against his own better judgment. "You don't belong here," he said, voice low, not quite accusation, not quite question. She turned, tray still balanced in her hands. Her eyes met his, calm, unshaken, infuriating. "Neither do you," she replied. The corner of his mouth twitched. Was it irritation, amusement? He couldn't tell. All he knew was that once again she had taken control of a conversation without even trying. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to tell her she was nothing. But the truth, heavy and undeniable, pressed against him. She was the first person in years who made him feel like a man, not a title. That night, staring at the city again, he whispered words he didn't expect to ever say. "She's not like anyone I've ever met." And for Daniel Whitmore, the man who controlled empires, the realization was as terrifying as it was irresistible. Wounds rarely announce themselves. They slip through in the smallest details: a hesitation, a glance that lingers too long, a silence too heavy to ignore. For Daniel Whitmore, the cracks appeared one afternoon during a strategy session. The conference room was filled with executives debating revenue forecasts. Charts glowed across the projector screen, numbers climbing and falling like heartbeats. Daniel sat at the head of the table, eyes sharp, posture commanding. To anyone else, he looked unshakable. But Anna noticed something different. She had been invited only to observe on behalf of her firm, yet she couldn't help watching him as the arguments unfolded. When one executive mentioned risk exposure in reference to a potential merger, Daniel's jaw tightened. It was subtle, just a flicker of tension, the way his hand gripped the pen too tightly before setting it down with controlled precision. Most people wouldn't have seen it, but Anna did. It was the same gesture she had once seen in her ex-husband, clenched control, the body betraying what the voice would never admit. It wasn't anger, it was fear disguised as command. Later, when the room emptied, Anna gathered her papers quietly. Daniel remained at the table, staring at the city beyond the glass walls. She hesitated, debating whether to leave in silence. Instead, her voice broke the quiet. "You don't trust them," she said softly. His head turned, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me. The people in that room," she continued, steady but calm. "You don't trust them, I can see it." His lips curved into something between a smirk and a warning. "And what makes you think you can read me, Ms. Morales?" Anna shrugged, slipping her folder into her bag. I read people, and yours says you've been betrayed before." The air thickened. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then, voice lower than before, he replied, "You have no idea what you're talking about." But she did. She just didn't press, because Anna carried her own ghosts. That evening, back in her apartment, she sat by the window with a cup of tea. The city outside buzzed with horns and sirens, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered the courtroom where her divorce had been finalized. The lawyer's words, her ex-husband's indifference, the humiliation of debts piled higher than her savings. She remembered waking up the next morning to silence, her belongings scattered, her trust shattered. Since then, she had learned to live carefully. She measured her choices, counted her pennies, guarded her heart. She told herself she was fine, and most days she was. But sometimes, when she saw the way Daniel's eyes hardened, when she caught the flicker of pain behind his authority, her own scars stirred. Two people, both broken in different ways, circling each other like predators and prey, not realizing how much of themselves they saw in the other. Their next collision came sooner than expected. It was a Thursday evening, late. Most of the staff had already gone home. Anna was in the records room, sorting through files for the upcoming case. She hated late nights in corporate buildings, the echo of her footsteps, the hum of fluorescent lights, the way glass windows turned into mirrors. When the door opened behind her, she startled. Daniel stepped in, tie loosened, jacket draped over his arm. He looked less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man worn down by hours of strain. "You're still here," he said. "So are you," she replied. He set his jacket on a chair, moving closer to the filing cabinets. "Most people don't stay past 8. I'm not most people," she said simply. He studied her for a moment, then asked, "Why do you work so hard? Doesn't anyone wait for you at home?" The question pierced deeper than he realized. Anna froze briefly before answering. "No, no one waits." Daniel caught the pause, the flicker of something in her eyes, loss, loneliness. He knew it too well. He wanted to ask more, but something inside him recoiled. Vulnerability was dangerous, his own and hers, so instead he deflected. "Work isn't worth that much sacrifice." Anna turned to him, arching a brow. "That's ironic, coming from you." For the first time he chuckled, a low, quiet sound like a door cracking open. "Fair enough." The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but heavy with something unsaid. Two people standing in the dim light of a records room, both pretending to be there for work, when in truth they were confronting pieces of themselves reflected in the other. Daniel broke it first. "You think you know me, Ms. Morales, but trust me, you don't." She met his gaze steadily. "I don't need to know everything. I just recognize the look." "What look?" "The look of someone who's still bleeding, even if no one else can see the wound." For a heartbeat, his mask slipped, the armor cracked, and in that tiny space, something unspoken passed between them, recognition, a shared understanding of pain. He turned away quickly, picking up his jacket, retreating before the moment could deepen. "Good night, Ms. Morales." "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," she answered. After he left, Anna stood alone in the records room, her heart unsteady. She told herself it was nothing, just an observation, just another man with scars like anyone else. But deep down, she knew, this wasn't nothing. because for the first time in years she had seen through someone else's armor, and someone had glimpsed behind hers. The universe has a cruel sense of humor. Sometimes it puts two people who least want to be near each other in the exact same place, and then locks the door. For Daniel and Anna, that door was the Whitmore Global Arbitration case. The dispute had escalated quickly, dragging in regulators and threatening millions in losses. Daniel wanted it handled with precision, no room for error. Anna's firm had been contracted to provide support, which meant she was now woven into the daily operations whether she or he liked it or not. The first official strategy meeting stretched for hours. Around the long mahogany table, attorneys shuffled papers, analysts clicked through slides, and Daniel presided at the head like a general before battle. Anna sat midway down, quietly reviewing the documents, but every so often her questions cut through the noise. Why are we assuming this timeline when the opposing counsel has already requested an extension? She asked at one point, voice steady. The room stilled. It wasn't her place to challenge. Junior attorneys rarely question strategy, and Daniel's presence made even seasoned partners tread carefully. Daniel lifted his gaze, sharp as glass. And what do you suggest, Ms. Morales? Account for their delay up front, Anna replied. If we build our case on best-case assumptions, we'll look unprepared when reality hits. It's not about losing faith in our argument, it's about not underestimating theirs. Silence again. Then Daniel's mouth curved slightly, not a smile exactly, more like reluctant acknowledgement. Noted. The meeting continued, but something had shifted. For the first time, he hadn't dismissed her outright. He had listened. Still, listening didn't erase tension. If anything, it sharpened it. Later that week, Daniel's assistant informed Anna she would be accompanying the senior team to Boston for a 3-day negotiation session. She nearly refused. Traveling with Whitmore Global wasn't part of her original assignment. But the request had Daniel's signature, and saying no wasn't really an option. So, on a rainy Thursday morning, Anna found herself boarding a company jet, sleek leather seats, polished wood, the faint scent of cologne and power in the air. She had never flown private. She didn't want to look impressed, so she kept her expression neutral, gripping her folder like a shield. Daniel noticed. He was seated across from her, jacket off, sleeves rolled neatly. He didn't speak at first, eyes scanning his tablet. But every so often his gaze flicked to her, as though gauging how she fit into this curated world. First time on a jet? He asked finally, voice casual but probing. First time on your jet, she corrected. He tilted his head. You don't seem surprised. Should I be? Most people are. Anna met his eyes steady. I'm not most people. The words hung between them, a reminder of the line they kept crossing. The flight passed in near silence after that, punctuated only by the hum of engines and the occasional rustle of papers. But silence wasn't empty. It brimmed with awareness neither wanted to name. In Boston, the real test began. The negotiations were grueling, stretching from early morning into late night. Hours in conference rooms, piles of evidence, tempers flaring across the table. Daniel was ruthless, calm but cutting, dismantling the opposition's arguments piece by piece. His reputation as an unshakable negotiator was no exaggeration. Anna watched, part of her admiring the precision, another part recoiling at the coldness. He didn't just win, he dominated. Every pause, every word, every gesture was calculated. But then came a moment when the opposing counsel brought up a clause Daniel had overlooked. For a second, his mask slipped. His eyes flickered, surprise, maybe even panic. Before anyone else noticed, Anna spoke. The clause is invalid, she interjected firmly. It contradicts Section 14(3), which overrides the stipulation. If you check the amended filing from last quarter, you'll see it. The room paused, papers shuffled. And she was right. Daniel's gaze snapped to her, something unreadable flashing behind it. Gratitude, irritation, both. Afterward, when the team regrouped, one of the senior lawyers muttered, "Good catch, Morales." Daniel said nothing, but later, as they left the building, he slowed his stride until she walked beside him. "You saved the case from unraveling today," he said quietly. Anna adjusted her bag. It's my job. No, he countered. Your job was to observe. You went beyond that. She glanced at him, uncertain how to take the compliment, or if it even was one. You don't strike me as someone who likes being corrected. He smirked faintly. I don't, but I like results. For a moment they walked in silence through the Boston rain, city lights blurring across wet pavement. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. Something had shifted again. By the time the trip ended, they had spent 3 days in each other's presence, debating, strategizing, even sharing the occasional late-night coffee in the hotel lounge when exhaustion blurred their edges. The distance between them hadn't disappeared, but it had narrowed. And for Daniel, that narrowing was dangerous. He was used to controlling relationships, keeping people in neat categories, ally, threat, asset, distraction. But Anna didn't fit. She challenged him, supported him, unsettled him. For Anna, the danger was different. She had vowed never to be pulled into someone else's orbit again, never to mistake power for intimacy. Yet she found herself noticing the cracks in his armor, the way his eyes shadowed when the conversations quieted, the weariness he tried to hide. They didn't admit it, not to each other, not even to themselves. But something had begun, something neither of them had chosen, yet neither could escape. Bound by circumstance, forced into cooperation, Daniel and Anna had become something neither expected, necessary to each other. And necessity has a way of softening even the sharpest walls. It was their last night in Boston. The negotiations had finally concluded, papers signed, handshakes exchanged. On paper, Whitmore Global had secured the advantage. In reality, everyone was exhausted. Executives dragging themselves back to hotel rooms, lawyers half asleep with laptops still open. Anna had slipped away from the noise, retreating to the hotel's rooftop lounge. She needed quiet, a chance to breathe. The city spread out beneath her, lights shimmering across the Charles River. She wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee, letting the steam warm her palms. She didn't hear him approach at first. You don't strike me as someone who likes crowds, Daniel said, his voice low, carrying just enough amusement to soften the words. Anna turned, startled, then composed herself. And you don't strike me as someone who likes silence. He stepped closer, suit jacket undone, tie loosened. He looked different in the dim glow of the rooftop, less like the CEO who commanded boardrooms, more like a man stripped of ceremony. Silence isn't always the enemy, he said. Sometimes it's the loudest thing in the room, Anna replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The city pulsed beneath them, but up here the world felt paused. Daniel leaned against the railing, studying her. You saved me today, he said suddenly. Anna frowned. The clause, he nodded. I would have missed it, and if I had, it could have cost us millions. It wasn't about saving you, she said quietly. It was about saving the case. There's a difference. He considered that. You really don't care about power, do you? No, she answered simply. Power isn't what keeps you warm at night. It doesn't fix the cracks. Daniel's eyes darkened. What does? Anna hesitated. She hadn't expected the question, hadn't expected the rawness in his voice. Finally, she said, understanding, knowing someone sees you, not the mask, not the title, just you. The words landed heavier than she intended. Daniel looked away, staring at the skyline. His chest tightened against memories he had buried. Elise's laughter, Elise's betrayal, the hollow echo of an apartment after she left. He had promised himself no one would ever see him again, not really. And yet here was Anna, speaking as though she had already seen through him. Do you believe people can change? He asked suddenly. Anna tilted her head. Change how? Change who they are, what they've done. She thought of her own past, the failed marriage, the debts, the years of clawing her way back. She thought of the mistakes she carried like invisible scars. Yes, she said at last, but not because someone else saves them. Because they decide to save themselves. He studied her as though trying to decide if she was telling the truth or if she was offering him a lifeline. Then maybe there's hope, he murmured almost to himself. Anna sipped her coffee, letting the silence stretch. This was dangerous ground. She had promised herself never to step into someone else's darkness, never again to confuse proximity for intimacy. But the honesty in his voice tugged at something in her chest. Can I ask you something? Daniel said, breaking the quiet. You just did. A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. Why do you keep your distance? Even when you're right in the middle of the fight, you hold yourself back. Why? Anna froze. She hadn't expected him to notice, much less ask. Slowly, she placed her cup down. Because I know what it feels like to lose myself in someone else's world, to wake up one morning and realize I don't recognize the person in the mirror anymore. His eyes softened, the sharp edges blunted by something unspoken. And you won't let that happen again. No, she said firmly, never again. They stood there, two people surrounded by skyscrapers, their silhouettes framed against a restless city. For the first time, the space between them didn't feel combative. It felt fragile, uncertain, but real. Daniel exhaled, his voice quieter now. If I told you I've been afraid of love for years, would you believe me? Anna met his gaze. Yes, she said without hesitation. He blinked, surprised. Why? Because only someone who's been hurt badly enough would build walls that high. The truth lingered between them like smoke. Daniel swallowed hard, throat tight. No one had ever said it so plainly. No one had dared. And for a moment, the man who ruled empires felt like nothing more than a man, tired, wounded, yearning for something he couldn't name. Anna didn't move closer, didn't touch him, didn't cross the line. She simply stood, present, steady, letting him feel seen without stripping him of dignity. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. You unsettle me. She raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a complaint. It's not, he admitted. The silence returned, heavier now, but not unwelcome. When Anna finally excused herself, gathering her bag, Daniel watched her go. He didn't stop her. He didn't have to, because the truth was already seared into him. He could face any opponent across a boardroom table, any competitor clawing for his empire. But this woman, with her quiet defiance and unflinching honesty, she was the first to slip past his defenses without even trying. And it terrified him, because he knew deep down he wasn't ready to let her go. Fragile things don't break with noise, they shatter in silence. The silence came 3 days after Boston, back in New York. Anna had returned to her routine, telling herself that whatever had passed between her and Daniel on that rooftop was temporary. A crack in his armor, nothing more. She buried herself in briefs and case notes, determined to forget the weight of his words. If I told you I've been afraid of love for years, would you believe me? But forgetting Daniel Whitmore was like trying to forget a storm. He lingered, in the way her thoughts drifted at odd moments, in the way her chest tightened when her phone buzzed with an email from his office. She told herself it didn't matter, and she believed it until the secret came out. It happened in the middle of a deposition. The opposing counsel, sharp and predatory, laid down a folder with a triumphant smile. Before we continue, we'd like to address a matter that speaks to Whitmore Global's credibility. The folder opened. Photocopies slid across the table, documents bearing Daniel's signature. Documents that, on the surface, suggested fraud. Gasps rippled. Daniel's attorneys scrambled, flipping pages, muttering objections, but Anna's breath caught for a different reason. She recognized the name on the paperwork, her father's construction company. Years ago, long before Daniel had become a billionaire, his fledgling firm had acquired contracts from struggling small businesses. Her father's was one of them. At the time, she hadn't understood the details, only that her father had lost everything, his workers laid off, their apartment nearly gone. The betrayal had broken him and in many ways broken their family. Now, staring at the documents, Anna realized whose signature was on the deal that had gutted her father's life. Daniel's. The room erupted into chaos, attorneys arguing, objections flying, the judge's assistant pounding for order. But Anna heard none of it. The air drained from her lungs, replaced by a cold, hollow ache. Across the table, Daniel caught her eyes. For the first time, his composure faltered. He knew. He saw the recognition in her face, the devastation. And in that split second, his mask cracked, not with arrogance, but with guilt. The session adjourned, the lawyers spilling into corridors, phones buzzing, strategies forming. Anna didn't wait. She gathered her things and walked out, her pace steady but her hands trembling. Anna, Daniel's voice followed her down the hall. She didn't turn. Anna, wait. She stopped only when he caught her arm outside the elevators. She yanked free, her voice sharp, raw. "You destroyed my family." His face tightened. "It wasn't." "Don't," she cut him off. "Don't you dare tell me it wasn't you. Your name is on those papers. Do you have any idea what that deal did to us? My father lost everything. He died thinking he was a failure." Daniel's throat closed. He remembered that deal. Not every detail. There had been hundreds like it, but he remembered enough. His company had acquired contracts at ruthless prices. He had told himself it was business, survival. He hadn't considered the families left in ruin. "Anna," he said quietly, "I didn't know. You didn't care." Her voice shook. "All this time I thought you were just arrogant, just another man who thinks the world bends for him. But now I see. You weren't just cold, you were the one who lit the match." The elevator dinged. She stepped inside. Daniel didn't follow. The doors closed between them, but the words lingered like broken glass. That night Daniel sat alone in his penthouse, whiskey untouched beside him. He replayed her words again and again. "You destroyed my family." He had built an empire on decisions like that, merciless, pragmatic, efficient. And he had always told himself it was necessary. Business required sacrifice. But for the first time he saw the cost in human terms in Anna's eyes, and it gutted him. Anna, back in her apartment, collapsed on her couch. She pressed her palms to her eyes, fighting back tears. She hated herself for the ache in her chest, for the betrayal that felt personal even though she had known all along what kind of man Daniel was. She thought of that rooftop conversation, of his voice when he confessed fear of love. She thought of the brief moment when she believed he might be different beneath the armor. And now she saw him not just as flawed, but as the very architect of her family's ruin. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the longing she still felt, the pull she couldn't extinguish. She hated that. She hated him. She hated herself. The next day at the office, they didn't speak. Daniel kept his distance, his gaze shadowed, while Anna avoided his floor entirely. The case moved forward, the lawyers strategized, but between them something fragile had already snapped. At night, Daniel drafted a message, deleted it, drafted again, deleted again. Anna did the same, words written in anger, then erased in exhaustion. Neither sent anything, and in the silence the distance grew. For the first time since their worlds collided, Daniel realized the one thing he couldn't control was the truth. And Anna realized the one thing she couldn't escape was him. Their fragile bond was broken, or maybe it had only revealed what it was built on, lies, wounds, and a history neither could outrun. But one question lingered, refusing to be buried. Was this the end, or the beginning of a reckoning? There are partings loud with shouting, doors slammed, words hurled like weapons. And then there are partings that cut deeper, partings spoken in silence, in the weight of everything left unsaid. For Daniel and Anna, silence became the language of their separation. In the days that followed the revelation, they moved through the same building as strangers. Meetings were attended, reports reviewed, deadlines met. But where once there had been glances, sharp words, reluctant respect, there was now nothing. Anna avoided him with surgical precision. If she saw him step into the elevator, she waited for the next. If his voice carried from a conference room, she chose another hallway. To her colleagues, she was as composed as ever, her notes flawless, her arguments sound. But inside, she was unraveling. Every night she replayed the deposition in her mind, the documents on the table, his name inked on the page, his eyes when he realized what it meant to her. She had thought betrayal belonged only to her past, a wound left by her ex-husband, by debts, by broken promises. She hadn't expected to find it again here in the one person who had made her believe, if only for a flicker, that she could be seen. Worse than anger was the ache of wanting to believe him anyway. She caught herself at odd hours, reaching for her phone, drafting words she never sent. "You knew, didn't you? Delete. Why didn't you tell me? Delete. Do you regret it? Do you regret me? Delete." Each message vanished into the void of her drafts, leaving only silence in their place. Daniel, for his part, drowned himself in work. If his empire had been built on relentless motion, now he pushed harder than ever. 12-hour days bled into 16. Board members praised his drive. Investors applauded his resolve. To them he looked unstoppable. But the truth was different. Every number on his spreadsheets blurred into Anna's face. Every late-night strategy session echoed with her voice. He had faced hostile takeovers, market crashes, betrayal by the woman he once loved. He had survived them all, but nothing had hollowed him like the sight of Anna looking at him as though he were the villain in her story. And maybe he was. He remembered the deal, the one that crushed her father's company. He remembered signing without hesitation, telling himself it was nothing personal, just business, survival. He had been young then, desperate to climb, to prove himself in a world that devoured weakness. But seeing it now, through her eyes, stripped away the illusion. What had been a triumph in his ledger was devastation in hers. More than once he opened his phone to type. "I didn't know, delete, I'm sorry, delete, please don't walk away, delete." But what right did he have to ask? He told himself silence was mercy, that leaving her alone was the least he could do. But every night, lying awake in a penthouse too quiet, he felt the weight of words unsaid pressing against him until he couldn't breathe. The weeks stretched on. One evening, Anna stayed late at the office, working through case files. The building was nearly empty, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the stillness. She gathered her things, walking through the lobby, and there he was. Daniel stood near the glass doors, coat draped over his arm, phone dark in his hand. For a moment neither moved, their eyes met, his shadowed, hers guarded. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence between them spoke louder than any apology. Anna shifted her bag higher on her shoulder and walked past him. Her footsteps echoed across marble, sharp, final. Daniel didn't follow. At home, Anna sat at her kitchen table, staring at the steam curling from her untouched tea. She told herself it was better this way. Distance, silence, safety. He couldn't hurt her again if she refused to let him close. But the truth ached in her chest. Silence didn't feel like safety. It felt like loss. She thought of the rooftop in Boston, the question he had asked her. "Do you believe people can change?" She had answered yes then, certain of it. But now she wasn't sure. Maybe people didn't change. Maybe they just revealed who they had always been. In his penthouse, Daniel poured whiskey into a glass and left it untouched on the table. He stood by the window, watching the city glow beneath him. From this height, the world looked perfect, lights glittering, streets pulsing with life. But he knew better. He had built his kingdom on fractures. He thought of Anna's words. Respect is earned, not demanded. She had been right. And he had spent his life demanding what he hadn't earned. He wanted to tell her that. He wanted to tell her everything, that Elise's betrayal had taught him to value power over people, that every ruthless deal had been a wall he built to keep from feeling small again, that when he looked at her, he felt for the first time like maybe he could be more than his mistakes. But he didn't. He only stood in the silence, a man surrounded by everything, haunted by the one thing he couldn't reach. Separation doesn't always come with goodbye. Sometimes it comes with silence so sharp it feels like a blade. And in that silence, both of them bled. The past doesn't knock politely. It barges in uninvited, carrying the weight of unfinished business. For Daniel Whitmore, the past arrived on a Tuesday morning, wearing a crimson dress and a smile sharp enough to slice glass. Elise, the woman who had once loved him, who had once destroyed him. She appeared in his office without warning, escorted by an assistant too intimidated to deny her entry. Daniel looked up from his desk, his jaw tightening at the sight. Time hadn't dulled her. Her hair fell in waves, her voice still carried the lilt of charm. But her eyes, those eyes that once softened at him, were colder now, calculating. "Daniel," she purred, crossing the room as though she still owned a part of it. "You look exactly the same." He set his pen down. "I'd say the same about you, Elise, except you're older." She laughed, unbothered. "Always so sharp, I missed that." Daniel leaned back, mask in place. "What do you want?" "A partnership," she said smoothly. "I've started something new, a venture fund, bold, disruptive. With your capital and my connections, we could reshape the market. Just like old times." Old times, he almost laughed at the irony. The old times had left him gutted, legally, emotionally, spiritually. Elise had walked away with secrets and lawsuits, leaving him to rebuild from ashes. But her timing was strategic. Whitmore Global was vulnerable. The arbitration case had rattled investors, whispers of fraud circling in hushed tones. Elise knew weakness when she smelled it. "I think you'll find the offer tempting," she added, sliding a folder across his desk. Daniel didn't touch it. He stared at her instead, 1,000 memories burning behind his eyes. Nights spent building dreams together, the betrayal that shattered them, the vow he had made never to let anyone close again. And then Anna. Her name surged through him like a heartbeat. Anna with her unflinching honesty. Anna with eyes that had seen through his armor. Anna who now looked at him like he was the villain in her story. For the first time since Elise walked in, Daniel's composure cracked. He didn't want this. He didn't want Elise or her offer, or the echo of a life built on manipulation. But he also knew one thing with brutal clarity. If Elise was here, circling back, then Anna would eventually hear. And when she did, it would only confirm everything she already believed about him. Anna's past had its own way of clawing back. That same week, she received an email from a former colleague at a nonprofit she once volunteered for. They wanted her back. The organization was struggling, funding cut, programs at risk. They needed someone steady, someone who could manage operations with limited resources. Anna stared at the email for a long time. Part of her longed to say yes, to leave behind boardrooms dripping with arrogance, to escape the orbit of a man who had broken her trust, to return to something pure. Work that mattered, work untouched by greed. But another part of her hesitated. She thought of Daniel, not the CEO in tailored suits, but the man on the rooftop in Boston, the man who had whispered he was afraid of love, the man she had almost believed in. Walking away meant never finding out if that man was real. She hated that the thought mattered. Their collision came that Friday in the lobby of Whitmore Global. Anna had stayed late for deposition, her bag heavy with files. As she stepped toward the revolving doors, Elise appeared, red dress like a flare in the night. She laughed at something Daniel said, her hand brushing his sleeve as they exited together. Anna froze. Daniel saw her instantly. Their eyes locked across the marble floor. His expression shifted, first surprise, then regret, then something close to desperation. But he didn't move. Elise's hand lingered on his arm. Anna's chest tightened. The image said everything her heart feared. Daniel hadn't changed. He never would. He belonged to that world, the world that had destroyed her father, the world where Elise thrived. She turned sharply, disappearing into the night before he could reach her. Later, Daniel found himself standing outside Anna's apartment building. He didn't know how he'd gotten there, only that silence was no longer bearable. He wanted to knock, to tell her Elise meant nothing, that he hadn't invited her, that her reappearance was a ghost he didn't want. But he didn't knock. He stood there, fists clenched, then walked away. Inside, Anna sat on her couch, staring at the nonprofit email on her laptop. Her cursor hovered over the reply button. A single word formed in her mind, yes, but she didn't press send. Because despite everything, the betrayal, the silence, the ghosts, part of her still wanted to hear him say the words he hadn't said. The past had returned for both of them, Elise with her venomous charm, the nonprofit with its fragile hope. And between past and present, Daniel and Anna stood at a crossroads, unable to move forward, unwilling to step back, haunted by what once was and what might never be. Confessions don't arrive neatly packaged. They stumble out, raw and unfinished, in the moments when silence has become unbearable. For Daniel, silence had been gnawing at him for weeks. Anna's absence was everywhere, an empty chair in conference rooms, a quiet hallway where he used to glimpse her steady stride, the vacant space she left in his thoughts. He had tried to bury it under deals and deadlines, but work no longer numbed him. The truth pressed harder each day, until finally it broke. It was late evening when he went to her apartment. He didn't plan it. His driver dropped him off, and instead of giving instructions to take him home, Daniel found himself standing on the cracked sidewalk outside her building. The air smelled faintly of rain, the city's hum rising like a restless heartbeat. For a long moment he hesitated. The man who could walk into any boardroom in the world and command it now stood paralyzed in front of a nondescript door. Finally, he forced himself to move, knocking once, twice. The door opened. Anna stood there, her expression guarded. She didn't seem surprised, as though she had always known this moment would come. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't close the door either. "Why are you here?" she asked, voice quiet, flat. Daniel swallowed. "Because I can't stay away." Her eyes narrowed. "That's not an answer." He drew a breath, his control faltering. "I came to tell you what I should have said weeks ago. I came to tell you the truth." Anna crossed her arms, leaning against the frame. "The truth, or your version of it." He flinched at the edge in her tone, but didn't retreat. "I was ruthless. In business, I made choices that hurt people. Your father's company, I signed the papers that ended it. I told myself it was just survival. I didn't think about the families. I didn't think about you. That's the truth." Her face didn't soften. "So why now? Why not then?" "Because then," Daniel admitted, voice cracking, "I didn't care who I became as long as I won. I thought winning would protect me from betrayal, from weakness, from ever feeling small again. But then you walked into my world and suddenly—" He stopped, struggling for words. "Suddenly what?" she pressed. "Suddenly I cared again," he said, the words rushing out. "I cared what you saw when you looked at me. I cared if you thought I was more than the man who crushed your father's dreams. And I hated myself because I knew I wasn't, not yet." The silence between them deepened. Anna's chest rose and fell, steady but strained. She wanted to look away, but his eyes held hers with a desperation that was uncharacteristic, almost childlike. "You think words fix this?" she asked finally. "No," he said quickly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I need you to know that when I'm with you. I'm not the man they write about in the papers. I'm not the CEO in the glass tower. I'm just a man," he broke off, his voice unsteady. "A man who doesn't know how to be without you." The admission startled even him. He had rehearsed a dozen versions of this speech, polished them in his mind, but none of those versions had survived the moment. Only the truth remained, jagged and raw. Anna's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "You don't need me to survive, Daniel." He stepped closer, careful, as though any sudden movement might shatter what little ground remained between them. "No," he said softly. "I don't need you to survive. But if you walk away, I won't be the same man. I'll go back to the one who destroyed without looking, who conquered because it was easier than caring, and I don't want to be him anymore." Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. She had expected denial, excuses, maybe even manipulation. She hadn't expected this. His vulnerability laid bare, his power stripped away, his need confessed without bargaining. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of choices neither was ready to make. Finally, Anna stepped aside, just enough to let him in. Daniel crossed the threshold slowly, as though entering sacred ground. Her apartment was small, modest, nothing like the cavernous luxury he lived in. But it felt warmer, more alive. A half-read book lay on the couch. A candle flickered faintly on the counter. It was a life lived honestly, without masks. He turned to her, his voice quieter now. "I can't ask you to forgive me tonight. Maybe not ever, but I can ask you for this, for a chance to prove that I can be different, that I can be more than the man who hurt you." Anna studied him, her heart warred with itself, reason shouting that he was dangerous, memory whispering of the rooftop where he had looked less like a titan and more like a man afraid. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she said, "If I let you stay, Daniel, it's not because I've forgotten. It's because I want to see if you can live without the armor." He nodded, relief flickering through his eyes. "Then I'll try for as long as it takes." The night settled around them, heavy but no longer suffocating. For the first time, words had cut through silence, not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly. And honesty, for two people who had lived too long behind walls, felt like the beginning of something neither dared name. Forgiveness isn't a gift you hand out easily. It isn't a pardon stamped on paper or a ribbon tied around regret. Forgiveness is heavier than that. It's a choice to stop carrying the knife even while the wound still aches. Anna knew this. She had spent years learning how to live without bitterness. But standing across from Daniel Whitmore, the man who had once shattered her family and now stood stripped of his armor, forgiveness felt like the most impossible choice she had ever faced. The days after his confession blurred together. Daniel didn't press. He didn't try to manipulate her into an answer. He simply showed up, not at her door, not uninvited, but in the small ways that mattered. He attended meetings without the usual arrogance. He listened more, interrupted less, and when his eyes met hers across the table, they didn't demand, they asked. For Anna, the change was unsettling. She wanted to dismiss it as performance, another mask, but it wasn't polished. It was clumsy, uneven, the kind of change that couldn't be faked because it lacked refinement. One evening, after another long day in court, she found herself walking beside him down a quiet street. The city's noise was muted here, the glow of street lamps spilling across wet pavement. Daniel carried his coat over his shoulder, his tie loose. He looked less like a billionaire and more like a man unmoored. "Why do you keep trying?" Anna asked suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. He glanced at her. "Because for the first time in my life, trying feels like the only thing that matters." She stopped, folding her arms. "You think effort erases the past?" "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "Nothing erases it. I'll always be the man who signed that deal. I'll always carry that, but I don't want it to be the only truth about me, not to you." Her chest tightened. The honesty in his voice disarmed her more than any polished apology ever could. They walked on in silence until they reached her building. She turned to him, studying the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet plea he didn't voice. "You hurt me," she said softly. "Not just me, my family. My father died believing he had failed us. That weight doesn't vanish because you regret it now." Daniel's throat constricted. "I know." She took a breath, steady but trembling. "And yet," her words trailed off. He leaned closer, careful not to touch, afraid even of the air between them. "And yet," Anna's gaze didn't waver. "And yet I see you trying. I see the cracks in your armor, and I see a man who, for all his power, doesn't know how to carry his own heart." The silence thickened. Daniel's jaw clenched as if holding back everything he wanted to say. "I don't know if I can forgive you completely," Anna admitted. "Not yet, maybe not ever in the way you want, but I can choose not to let anger define what happens next." His eyes closed briefly, relief washing through him. When he opened them again, they glistened in the lamplight. "That's more than I deserve." "It's not about what you deserve," she said firmly. "It's about what I need to stop bleeding from wounds I didn't choose. Forgiveness isn't for you, Daniel, it's for me." The words hit him harder than any rejection. Forgiveness was not her surrender, it was her strength. And in that moment, Daniel understood what Elise never had. Love wasn't about winning or losing. It was about choosing. Again and again, to see someone not as perfect, but as possible. Anna turned toward her door, pausing only once more. "If we try again, it won't be about promises. Promises are too easy. It'll be about actions, about showing up when it matters." Daniel nodded. "Then I'll show up." Her lips curved faintly, not a smile, but something softer. "We'll see." That night, Daniel lay awake in his penthouse, the city glowing beneath him. For the first time, the silence didn't suffocate. It carried her words like a bomb. "Forgiveness isn't for you, it's for me." He realized he didn't want her forgiveness as absolution. He wanted it as connection. Proof that he could still matter beyond his empire, beyond his mistakes. And Anna, back in her modest apartment, curled beneath a blanket with her book unread, felt the strange calm of a storm finally easing. Forgiveness hadn't erased her pain, but it had loosened its grip. For the first time in years, she felt like the past no longer chained her future. Still, doubt lingered. Could a man like Daniel truly change? Could she trust the actions that followed his words? She didn't know, but she knew this: she wasn't ready to walk away, not yet. Forgiveness was not the end. It was the fragile beginning of something new, and both of them, scarred and uncertain, stepped into it with trembling hands. Love, Anna realized, wasn't a sudden firework or a sweep of violins. It was quieter than that, heavier. It was the decision to keep showing up even when it was hard. Weeks passed after her fragile offering of forgiveness. Daniel didn't rush. He didn't demand. He seemed to understand that whatever path they were on now required patience, not control. And so he began to practice something unfamiliar to him: presence. At the office, he no longer barked orders for the sake of authority. He listened. When junior staff stumbled through presentations, he corrected without humiliation. When Anna spoke in meetings, he didn't just hear, he considered. To others, the change seemed subtle, barely noticeable. But to Anna, who had seen the man behind the armor, it felt seismic. One afternoon, she found him in the cafeteria, not surrounded by executives, but seated across from an intern, talking through a problem set like a professor guiding a student. She paused in the doorway, watching. This was not the Daniel Whitmore she had first met in the marble lobby, the man who demanded respect at every turn. This was someone else, still sharp, still powerful, but choosing to bend instead of break those around him. Later that evening, as they left the building together, she said softly, "You're different." He glanced at her, faint smile tugging at his lips. Different good or different bad? Different deliberate? He nodded, gaze forward. "I'm trying." The words weren't grand, but they carried more weight than any vow. Change, however, wasn't without friction. One night, Daniel invited Anna to a charity gala. She resisted at first. She didn't belong in gowns and chandeliers. But he insisted, not with pressure, but with quiet sincerity. "I want them to see you," he said. She went. The ballroom glittered with wealth, diamonds catching light, laughter echoing against high ceilings. Daniel moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, exchanging sharp words dressed as pleasantries. Anna stayed close, uneasy, feeling the weight of eyes appraising her. She wasn't glamorous enough, wasn't polished enough. A woman leaned in with a smile too bright. "And you are." "Anna Morales," Anna replied calmly. "Ah," the woman said, eyes flicking toward Daniel. "So you're the new charity project?" Heat rose in Anna's chest. She opened her mouth, but before she could respond, Daniel's voice cut through, cool and firm. "She's not a project. She's the reason I'm still standing." The woman blinked, caught off guard, then laughed it off, retreating into the crowd. Anna exhaled slowly. "You didn't have to say that." "I did," Daniel replied, his eyes steady on hers, "because it's true." It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the way movies scripted them, but in its raw honesty it was more powerful. Commitment revealed itself in smaller ways, too. Daniel learned to slow down, something he had never done in his life. On Saturdays, instead of locking himself in meetings, he walked with Anna through Central Park. They bought hot dogs from street vendors, sat on benches, watched children race boats in the pond. He marveled at how ordinary moments could feel extraordinary when shared. Anna, for her part, learned to open the door wider. She allowed him into pieces of her world she had always kept locked. She took him to her mother's old neighborhood in Queens, showed him the laundromat she grew up above, the park where she had played as a girl. Daniel listened, not with pity, but with respect. "This is where you learn to fight," he said quietly. "And to survive," Anna added. He took her hand, not tightly, but gently, as if to say, "You don't have to do it alone anymore." But not everything was seamless. Daniel's instincts for control still surfaced. When Anna's firm faced budget cuts, his first reaction was to write a check. "You can't just solve everything with money," she said sharply. "Why not? I have it. It would fix the problem." She shook her head. "It would fix the symptom, not the cause. And it would make me feel like another deal you closed, not someone you believe in." The words stung, but he listened. And slowly he learned to offer support without commandeering her choices. It was messy, imperfect. Some days they argued, some days they withdrew, but each time they returned. Each time they chose again. One night after a long walk, they ended up on Anna's rooftop. The city stretched below, alive and restless. Daniel leaned on the railing, his tie loosened, his hair mussed by the wind. "I used to think love was possession," he admitted. "Owning, controlling, winning. And now?" Anna asked. He glanced at her, eyes softer than she had ever seen. "Now I think love is standing beside someone even when it terrifies you, especially when it terrifies you." Anna's chest tightened. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining. They stood there, not as savior and saved, not as CEO and paralegal, but as two scarred people choosing to walk forward together. Love wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a commitment, a practice. A promise not of perfection, but of presence, and for both of them that was enough. Happily ever afters belong to storybooks. Real life doesn't tie itself with ribbons. It leaves frayed edges, half-finished sentences, and roads that stretch too far to see the end. Daniel and Anna stood on such a road. It was a Sunday morning in early spring. The city was waking slowly, church bells ringing somewhere in the distance, dogs tugging leashes through Central Park, the smell of fresh bagels wafting from corner shops. Anna and Daniel walked side by side, the pace unhurried, the air cool against their faces. To anyone watching, they looked ordinary. A man and a woman strolling in silence, hands occasionally brushing, not quite holding, not quite pulling away. But inside, the silence was full of memories, of pain endured, of choices made and unmade. Anna paused at a bench beneath a budding oak tree. She sat, smoothing her coat across her lap. Daniel sat beside her, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. "You know this isn't going to be easy," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Daniel nodded. "I don't want easy." She studied him, the man she had once hated, the man who had shattered her family, the man who had stood in her apartment weeks ago with his armor stripped away. He was still Daniel Whitmore, the CEO, the billionaire, the name printed in headlines, but he was also something else now, a man learning to bend without breaking. "People will question us," she said. "Your world doesn't forgive easily, and mine," she trailed off. "Mine has never belonged to yours." "Then we build a world of our own," Daniel replied, his voice low but firm. Anna almost smiled. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," he admitted, "but it's worth it." The words hung between them, fragile and true. Later that day, Daniel took her to his penthouse. She had been there before, once, briefly, but always as an outsider. This time he opened the door and stepped back, as though inviting her into more than just his home. She walked through slowly, her eyes taking in the expanse of glass and steel, the skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was beautiful but cold, a place built for winning, not for living. "You live here," she said, her tone unreadable. "I exist here," he corrected. Her gaze drifted to the empty dining table, long enough to seat 12 but polished from disuse. No meals shared, no laughter echoing, just silence. "You don't have to stay in emptiness," she said softly. Daniel turned to her, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. "Then fill it with me." It wasn't a plea, it wasn't ownership, it was an offering. Anna didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, staring at the city sprawling endlessly below. So much of his world still terrified her, the wealth, the scrutiny, the ruthless edges. But she also knew her world terrified him, the simplicity, the vulnerability, the risk of being ordinary. Perhaps that was the point. They unsettled each other, and maybe love wasn't supposed to be comfortable. She turned back, her expression softer now. "I'll stay sometimes, not to lose myself in this, but to share it, on my terms, on ours." Relief crossed his face, not dramatic, but visible in the way his shoulders eased. "That's all I ask." That night they cooked together in his cavernous kitchen. It was awkward at first, Daniel fumbling with a knife he barely knew how to use, Anna laughing at his attempts to follow her directions. But slowly the space filled with warmth, the sizzle of garlic in oil, the clink of plates, the hum of conversation that felt more alive than the city outside. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was theirs. And when they sat at the long dining table, plates steaming in front of them, Daniel looked around and realized he was experiencing something money had never bought him. Presence. Anna noticed his quiet gaze and asked, "What are you thinking?" "That this is the first time this place feels like a home," he said. Her chest tightened. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. She laced her hand with his, steady and deliberate. The days ahead would test them. Daniel knew his past would never fully disappear. Anna knew her scars wouldn't magically fade. There would be arguments, setbacks, doubts. There would be moments when old fears clawed back, when trust wavered, when forgiveness felt fragile again. But there would also be choices. Daily, ordinary choices. To listen, to stay, to rebuild. Love wasn't the fire that burned them together in one dazzling moment. It was the steady flame they would tend day by day against winds determined to put it out. On their way out that evening, they stood by the door, coats in hand. Daniel paused, watching her with the faintest smile. "What?" Anna asked. He shook his head. "I just keep thinking I almost lost this before it began." "You still could," she reminded him, though her voice carried no threat, only truth. "I know," he said quietly. "That's why I won't stop trying." Anna held his gaze, then nodded. "Then we'll try together." Outside, the city buzzed on, unaware of the fragile beginning unfolding behind glass towers. They walked into the night, not hand in hand at first, but side by side. And then slowly, Daniel reached for her. This time Anna didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined not as chains but as a promise. They didn't know where the road would lead. They didn't know if the future would be kind or cruel, but for now, for this step this night, it was enough. Two people scarred but unbroken, walking forward not toward a fairy tale, but toward something harder, truer. Toward the kind of love that isn't written in headlines, but lived in moments. As they disappeared into the crowd that Sunday evening, Anna thought for the first time in years that maybe she could stop running from the past. And Daniel, walking beside her, believed, against every instinct he had, that he might still learn how to love without control. But even as their steps aligned, shadows lingered. Because there was still one truth Daniel had never spoken, one decision buried deep in his empire that could break everything they were trying to build. And sooner or later, Anna would discover it.